Mike Polydorus, how are you?
Hey, Paul. How are you today?
I'm great. I'm really feeling good about this past weekend at the box office. You know, there was a lot of talk about superhero fatigue, with these big drop-offs on some of these recent films and, having, especially for Marvel, their last several films dropping in the 60% range. And then along comes Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, third installment, quite obviously, with the third smallest drop for the MCU with a 47.63% second weekend drop, according to our Comscore data. That's just below Black Panther, the original Black Panther, which had a 44.72% second weekend drop, and the first Thor movie that came out back in 2011, which had a mere 47.2% drop. But again, Thor opened with 65.7 million, so that was a little bit different. That wasn't even a $100 million opener, but a great second weekend hold. Guardians opening weekend over the weekend of 5/5, May 5th, that is, for you paying attention at home. $118.4 million opening, second weekend of 62 million. That 62 million was up from the estimate, which was around 60.5 million domestically. So what do you think, Mike? Is there superhero fatigue or just bad movie fatigue? What's going on here?
You took the words right out of my mouth. It is bad movie fatigue, without a doubt. Right now, Guardians of the Galaxy has outgrossed the entire run of Quantumania. Now, the big difference between the two movies are Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, A Cinema Score, Quantumania, B Cinema Score. And while it doesn't sound like a lot in a grade world, it's a ton. And you're seeing the difference in the playability right now. And with the way the movie is set up, Guardians has a nice little runway in front of it. Yes, it has Fast X opening this week, but that will be a momentary blip on Friday, and by Saturday it'll level out. So I expect Guardians to have a very nice run, and you're seeing it. I mean, even the weekdays have been great. This movie, again, it delivers what the fans want to see. So
Mike, does opening weekend really only matter in terms of the success of a movie if the movie doesn't get good reviews or low audience scores? In other words, they got to hit it big on the opening with the marketing. But a movie that's good, it doesn't matter what the opening is if it's still doing well 2 weeks, 3 weeks later. Look at Puss in Boots. Look at John Wick. I mean, it's really kind of interesting.
Well, the opening does matter, though, because the opening sets the baseline of the amount of people that see it. And as we've talked about on previous podcasts, that creates your multiple as far as where are you going to go from that gross.
Right.
So the opening matters, but at the same time, when you get something like Guardians of the Galaxy, which has huge playability, you're starting at a certain high level and you're just going to play from there.
Well, Mike, now you're bringing up a great point because it reminds me of when Avatar, The Way of Water opened to a mirror, I think it was 134 million, and people had declared it a misstep. And even with Guardians Volume 3, I think a lot of people thought it would do 130, 140 in its opening, and it only did 118.4 million opening, which was much bigger than the Sunday estimate. So for movies like this that have great reviews, come back and see me in a month and we'll see where the movie is, because that's a big part of it.
Well, and it's the tale of two movies, and you kind of hit it on the head when we were just talking about audiences, whether or not they like a movie or not. Look at something like Super Mario Brothers. Very analogous to what we're talking about with Guardians of the Galaxy. Now, Super Mario was one that, unlike Guardians, which has a high critic review as well, Super Mario was so-so with the critics, but the fans loved it.
Yeah.
So what happened was, over the course of the weekend, just like we saw with Guardians, every estimate was a little bit higher than the estimate before. So going into opening weekend of Guardians of the Galaxy, everything had toned down. Early on, it had been, well, it could do 130, it could do 140, as you mentioned. It was really down to around 100, 110 was what people were thinking the movie would do. And then Saturday morning, it's like, well, maybe 110 is 112. And then it was, well, maybe it's 114. And then by the time it topped out, it was 118, which is a precursor for where this is going as far as from a playability standpoint. You can see it on a weekend normally on how it plays out day by day by day. Mario was the same way. Every day of the Mario Brothers, that opening 5 days, the number just kept growing as far as what the expectations are.
That's a great point because, I used to always look at the Saturday drop. And if you had a movie that opened on Friday and dropped huge on Saturday, like the next day, that was never a good sign.
No.
Sort of a microcosm of what was yet to come in the trajectory for any given movie was that Friday to Saturday drop. Now, of course, films that have a Thursday preview folded in, baked into the cake on Friday, we don't have to get into all that, but that can impact the percentage drop.
I mean, I actually think we should get into that a little bit for some of the box office watchers that are out there.
Okay.
The Thursday number absolutely impacts that. And what's impacting it even more now is a lot of studios are taking movies and they're having early access screenings. 80 for Brady did this. Mafia Mama did it, where you'll have an early access screening. That money gets rolled in with the Thursday money and added to Friday. So your Friday drop can be a bit of an over-exaggerated drop. It's not really what it is.
That's right.
Because maybe you might have added 40% to the gross just because that's what comes in from this additive gross.
But then, Mike, that brings up a good point. I remember working with a news organization years ago. They would reach out and they were real sticklers on that back in the day when they started folding in the previews. Now, if you have a preview that starts as they used to at midnight, I think that's fair game. It absolutely should be folded in. But now the studios do it as a matter of course. That's SOP, that they just fold in the Thursday into the Friday, and that can misrepresent that Friday to Saturday drop. It actually, like you said, exaggerates it. You can pull those numbers out, but not everyone is doing that. Not all the studios want to do that, but it does present a mathematical conundrum at times.
Well, you can do a little reverse engineering. And, one of the things I usually look at is what is the pure Friday to the Saturday increase? And normally when on an opening weekend, if you have just a regular movie, if you're looking at a 25% increase, that's a pretty good, pretty standard kind of increase. But if you see something that's in the 40, 45, 50%, that shows really good playability. And especially when you get something that's extremely front-loaded like a Guardians or a Super Mario, where you have these extreme numbers, any kind of increase from Saturday over Friday is a major feat.
Yeah.
So as you're looking at the numbers, as you're looking at all the different charts that are out there, I think it's important for people to understand how much money has really been baked into that Friday number and how is that really affecting and what is the real increase from one day to another, because that's really indicative of, is the movie having playability? And are people interested in seeing the movie? And is there going to be longevity in how that movie plays out?
Yeah. Do you remember the days where we would take that Thursday preview and you could really extrapolate out what the weekend was going to do? And then that changed, where you could have a movie that didn't break the bank on a Thursday and then still do huge numbers on the weekend. And I remember early on in my career, that was an early lesson for me. Because if a movie doesn't absolutely kill it in the Thursday previews, it's over before it started on the weekend. Then you'd have a movie not do that well. And it depends on the type of movie, who the audience is and all that, and whether the preview started at 6 p.m. or midnight or whatever. But now you can't necessarily ascribe a performance of a movie or project it for a weekend based on if the Thursday numbers, let's say, aren't that great. Conversely, if they're huge, that doesn't always mean that it's going to have a huge weekend. It's kind of interesting how that's changed.
Some movies, depending on if they're quote unquote the fanboy movies, can be extremely front loaded on a Thursday.
Yeah.
And that might be something that, going back to some movies I've worked on, we had a movie a few years ago called Hellboy with David Harbour. The movie was extremely front loaded on Thursday. If you would looked at the Thursday gross, you were like, it's going to have a great weekend. But that was a movie where everybody ran out on Thursday. And by Friday afternoon, it was like, okay, seen it. Bye. And, by the time you got to Sunday, it was crickets that were joining you in the auditoriums.
Isn't that funny, too, how, especially in the era of social media, you and I have both been in this business long enough to know that back in the day, and by in the day, I mean the 80s, the 90s, and actually pre-social media, a movie could avoid bad word of mouth until Monday.
You could cheat a gross. If you came up with a really good marketing campaign, you could cheat a weekend.
You could, but now you can't, because people could get the word out immediately so that by Saturday, people know. Back in the olden days, you'd have to go to the virtual water cooler or get the newspaper on Monday and go, oh, wow, this movie didn't do well. Now it's immediate. And I think that's not lost on the industry at all.
No, no, no. And I think everybody understands that the minute you start screening a film, word of mouth is going to start leaking out. That's why when certain movies you hear, for instance, Disney screening the new Indiana Jones film, The Dial of Destiny, in Cannes this week, everybody immediately went to, the movie must be good, because Disney was not going to screen it and get tepid word of mouth coming out of that. Knowing how quickly word of mouth is going to spread, I think the anticipation for the movie immediately notched up a few after that announcement was made.
And you're right, Mike, because we all know that if a studio isn't confident, the last place you're going to show that movie is the Cannes Film Festival, because you will get absolutely destroyed. And you never know how international audiences are going to react to a movie. You might get a completely different reaction, or just the setting of the Cannes Film Festival, I think, impacts the perception of a movie. So huge. And also it's James Mangold, who I think has so much street cred as a filmmaker too, that's a filmmaker you can walk into with any genre of movie, big or small, and have a lot of confidence in it.
Well, going back to, let's talk about this past weekend for a second. Another weekend where we did $100 million of total box office, which is, again, very encouraging. I think it was the 14th straight weekend that we had a movie that grossed over $30 million at the domestic box office. The health of the industry is definitely on the rebound at this point. And then, Paul, you and I had talked about, you had noticed how many specialized films were in the marketplace this weekend.
Yeah, that was really cool. And I'm glad you brought that up, because the per location average for these movies, for instance, there was a movie called Monica. Actually, IFC Films had two movies that they opened, Blackberry and Monica. That shows not only confidence by independent distributors in the movie theater release for these independent films, but also that these films fill theaters. When you have high per theater averages, films that don't land in the top 10 are really doing well on a per theater basis. So Monica from IFC Films, along with Blackberry, The Starling Girl opened from Bleecker Street, La Immensita, forgive my pronunciation, another independent film out there. So there was just a lot of movies out there. There was something for everyone, Mike. And I think that was really borne out in the numbers. Because when I went through our list of what had opened this weekend, it was just loaded with films that opened in 175 theaters, 450 theaters.
Well, I was going to say, traditionally, it's very interesting. So the first part of summer is always, the late Steve Rothenberg used to always say this, and he goes, we have a lot of quality, but we don't have a lot of quantity. Meaning you have something like Guardians of the Galaxy, we have Super Mario that's still doing some business, but outside of that, you start coming down, and there is room for some of these smaller movies to go out and counter program and make a little bit of noise. As we start a little bit along the way, just looking ahead at the release schedule. So we had The Eye in the Storm of the Hurricane was this past weekend.
Right.
And then coming up on the 19th, this weekend, we've got Fast X, which looks like it's probably going to open to 65, 70 million. And then we have Memorial Day weekend, which we have Little Mermaid. And then we have three other, what I would say, counter programmings with The Machine. We have Kandahar, the action film. And then we have the family comedy About My Father from Lionsgate. And then when you get to June 2nd, Paul, you got another major, massive movie with Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the second volume of that.
Do you feel like, Mike, we're just getting started?
Big cut.
And you said it right, the eye of the storm, because the second weekend in May, I was asked a lot this weekend by various press outlets, what is it about this second weekend in May? I said, well, it's an opportunity. It's a sweet spot for movies that might get overlooked or wouldn't have a chance or would,
The other thing is, if you have a tentpole movie, think about this. You're mapping out the chessboard. You are now sitting in Mr. Studio's big whiteboard and you're trying to figure out where your pieces are going to go. I've got Guardians of the Galaxy week 2, which I know is going to go out. At that point, you're like, well, it's going to do 55. No, it did 62.
Right.
It actually overperformed on that. And then I've got Fast X that's coming up the week before. Do I sandwich myself in there and get pigeonholed, or do I just kind of wait for another date? So the second week of May, that second weekend, has traditionally been the eye of the hurricane, just because it's usually a Marvel movie. There's another movie set up the week after. And if you have the goods, you really don't want to get caught in between those two.
Absolutely not. And by the way, a Marvel movie up until 2020, for obvious reasons, has kicked off the summer movie season for at least a decade. And it's like clockwork. And like you said, when Mr. Studio Exec is sitting there with the whiteboard, they kind of automatically know you're going to be in the second weekend of a big Marvel movie. I probably don't want to program a movie that would be in the same category as far as audience demographic.
Right. Real quickly. So June 2nd, we said we've got Spider-Man Across the Spider-Verse, the animated sequel. Of course, we have Boogeyman, which is a horror film from Fox, which the Disney label.
Yep.
Then June 9th, we have the next Transformer movie. June 16th, we have Elemental, we have The Flash, and then we have The Blackening, which I hear is absolutely hilarious. And then on June 23rd, this is an interesting date. We have the R-rated comedy, the first one of the summer with Jennifer Lawrence, No Hard Feelings.
Yeah, we talked about that last week, I think.
But then we have another really interesting movie coming out, and that is Asteroid City.
Wes Anderson, baby.
And this looks like this could be a shot in the arm to our friends in the more upscale independent cinema.
Yeah.
And then you look at June 30th, and then we have Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, as we talked about. Then you also have the animated film Rudy Gilman, Teenage Kraken from Universal. And then there's the Fantasy Herald and the Purple Crayon from Sony. July 7th, we have Joyride, which screened ridiculously well at CinemaCon.
Oh, yeah, it screened at CinemaCon. But Mike, can I stop you there? Because I'm getting super excited about where you're about to be on this calendar, man. Because when you look at Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning, I don't mean to steal your thunder here, Mike, but you're about to get to that movie. And then the next weekend is Barbie Oppenheimer.
Yep.
Come on, man. Like, that is one of the coolest. And then Indiana Jones, you just talked about. What a month, late May, June, July.
Well, you go all the way through May, June, and July, and it's just one weekend after another. And that goes back to more of a traditional classic summer where every weekend has got something new that is going to interject that buzz into the movie theaters. And as we've discussed on previous podcasts, movie going begets movie going. It's a habit. It's something that people enjoy doing. And let's face it, during a pandemic, nobody was going to the movies. So it's a habit that we're reintroducing to people, but we're seeing it pan out. Now, I talked to a friend of mine and we were talking about independent cinema. And unfortunately, that is a little more sluggish and is taking a little bit longer to rebound. The question is it ever going to fully rebound, or is it just DOA? One of the guys who runs one of the leading independent distributors asked over the weekend, is book club, the fact that older audiences didn't respond to that, is that another sign? Or, and the fact that Downton Abbey was half of what the first one was, should we be concerned at those audiences? My response kind of goes back to your response on superhero fatigue, and that is, we give them good movies, I think they're going to come up. I mean, 80 for Brady was a win, and I think, book club, the second one, the reviews were not great, the audience scores were not great. I mean, this just might be a case of it was a movie that really wasn't...
Mike, I think you're right. I mean, look at Ticket to Paradise.
Yeah.
I mean, that movie killed. So what? Suddenly that audience is gone? No, the movie wasn't there that they wanted to see.
And I think the subtext might be the audience is there, but maybe they're a little more discerning than they used to be.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the takeaway from all of this, that maybe what they used to accept as a good night out, the bar is raised just a little bit on that to get them over the...
But that's good, Mike, and that's what Volume 3 Guardians of the Galaxy shows. Make better movies, and the marketing comes into play too, release date, all that. And some of it's a little bit of that magic dust, like you always say, the movie gods. And I agree with you wholeheartedly, but we're coming up on time here. I want to get to something really quick, more of an open question, and kind of leave our listeners hanging with. So I've been going out there recently looking at the summer movie season and looking at last year, which Mike wound up at $3.44 billion domestically for the summer movie season, first Friday of May through Labor Day Monday, as we define it at Comscore, and I think everybody else defines it that way. Traditionally, this summer movie season domestically would earn in the $4 billion plus range. That happened in 19, in 2018, almost got there in 17. 16 was at well over $4 billion, 15, 2014, 2013, $4.8 billion for the summer. Now, here's my question to you, Mike. It's mathematics. Typically, the summer movie season accounts for 40% of the total year. Last year, Mike, we did $3.44 billion. I'm looking at this lineup and I'm saying, do we get to $4 billion this summer? And if so, I don't think it's 40% of the year, because that would mean we would hit $11 billion this year. I don't know that we do that. Maybe this summer is going to be different. In other words, it may represent a bigger percentage of this particular full year than in other years. But I mean, I figure, Mike, if we got to $3.44 billion, Maverick and other big movies last year notwithstanding, this looks like an even better summer. Is there $600 million left in the tank to get us to $4 billion?
There could be. The one thing I'll say about this holiday season, if you look ahead as opposed to last year we had two movies that basically pulled their weight.
By holiday season, you mean post-summer. Is that what you mean?
Well, I'm actually talking, let's get into the post-Thanksgiving into Christmas.
Okay.
Last year, we had two movies that did any kind of real business. It was Avatar and it was Puss in Boots. That was it. Everything else just kind of...
Yeah. And Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, and I think that was...
Yeah, but that was, by the time we got to December, that had kind of done its thing.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about, if you look at the holiday season this year, there's 5 or 6 movies that look like they've got some significant gross in there. So that would be my number one thing to talk about. You know, you and I have been going back and forth on this for the last few months, and my number, I think, is 10. I think 10 billion becomes the domestic full year. I think 10 billion would be kind of the over-under, and that would put us at roughly 10% off of where a quote-unquote traditional year would be. Now, of course, the naysayers are going to come, well, the ticket prices have increased, so your admissions are actually down. Phooey and hogwash.
Yeah, that's what I'd say too.
Everything has gone up. I would say that, you know, if we can be around $10 billion, you know, at the end of the year, we'll be in a...
Mike, newsflash, I just did the math on my Excel sheet here.
Yeah.
So I was trying to figure out, okay, if the year does 10 billion and we get a summer that's at 4 billion, guess what the percentage of the year that summer represents? And I'm out to more than 2 decimal points.
Like 40% or so?
40% on the nose. So we're saying it here first. Don't hold us to this. But I think going from 3.44 billion summer of 2022 to 4 billion summer of 23 is not a stretch. And if we get to 10 billion, you know, there's others who'd say, watch it, you're getting a little ahead of yourself. But I mean, Mike, to the 0, like 40%, I think you heard it here first.
Well, I mean, if you're talking about, we were at 7.5 last year. And if we're talking about, okay, summer's going to be, you know, $500 million better than we were last year.
Yeah.
The first quarter was already significantly better. We were almost 800 million better then.
Right.
And then if you look at where we are, as I mentioned, going into the holiday period, the Christmas holiday period, it all adds up. That is a very doable number.
Yep.
The other thing I think everyone should be aware of, and which is great news, is last summer, clearly we were driven by Top Gun Maverick. There were other movies that did that, but Top Gun Maverick completely overperformed, doing $718 million. This year, we would exceed that number, but we would be spreading out the wealth among other films.
Absolutely. I mean, there were other big movies last summer, but emotionally, perception-wise, it was all about Maverick. This year, it's like, you're right, the riches are out there and they're plentiful. And I want to bring up one point that keeps coming up about the year-to-date, which we're about 29% ahead of last year. And then everyone says, well, Paul, what about, where are we versus 2019? Which is a fair question. We're down 24%. Okay, 2023 year-to-date through May 14th. Now, like I looked at the number of wide releases at this point this year, 32. At this point in 2019, 39. So we're 7 more wide releases, and yet we're only down 24%, 23 versus 2019, and we're up 30% over last year. This is all really good news when you look at the math, but everybody wants to keep going back to 2019. Remember, at this point...
Well, I was going to say, what I would say to all these people is that a year ago, they had this industry dead and buried. And, you know, now they're complaining because you're not quite back to where you were in 19. And it's like...
Right. It's like, let's look at the glass half full, not half empty, people.
Everybody should know that by the time this podcast drops, you will have seen Paul on the KTLA Morning News doing his summer preview. And I hope while he's doing the summer preview, he is expounding upon exactly what we've just talked about. So...
Yeah, I will have been live on something I've done every year, except during the middle of the pandemic, which is the KTLA summer movie preview, where we actually go on set down at KTLA, which is in the heart of LA. And literally they'll have people skating around. They'll have an ice cream setup. They'll have people playing beach ball. It's just a crazy. One year we had a couple of the people from Fast and Furious there, and we had a bunch of vintage cars, and we actually broadcast from a vintage car. And I have a picture of that up on my Twitter feed. And Scott Mantz and Sam Rubin are my partners in crime on that. I'll be there live on Wednesday morning, but this will probably come out on Thursday. But that's always a fun one to do, Mike. And we're going to be focusing on the Barbie Oppenheimer weekend, because, you know, you only get a few minutes live on this thing.
Right.
And they wanted to talk about Oppenheimer. I said, you cannot talk about Oppenheimer. You know, it's Mattel versus the Manhattan Project on that weekend. And I think that's going to be really an interesting weekend. And again, a week after Mission Impossible. It's crazy.
Again, as we keep talking about the summer and how it is lining up, I mean, this is going to be one of the better summers that the industry has seen from a diversity standpoint, which, you know, just a number of films that are contributing. I mean, this is one in the last 10 or 15 years that I can think of that, you know, has so many films that...
This is one of the biggest summers ever. I think that's great news. And one quick thing before we go, I want to mention that Air, which dropped on Amazon Prime on Friday, actually wound up number 9, I believe, for the weekend in movie theaters. And I believe there was a promotion, a ticket promotion with that. But either way, I mean, that's just astounding that people watched it at home, but still chose to go to the movie theater to see the movie Air. And again, that is not a big special effects movie. It's not a big, you know, like superhero film or franchise action movie. And yet people are enjoying that character study on the big screen.
Well, and one last thing before we go is I want to give a big shout out to all of the NATO managers that we saw last week and this week. We were up in Sacramento. NATO of California, Nevada did a big managers seminar where they rolled out all the product. The studios came up and showed them all the product that we've just discussed. This week we were at LA Live and had another great group of managers, and I want to thank all of them for tuning in and all of their support. You know, again, they're going to be working pretty hard this summer. So,
yeah, without you, I think so. And without them or without you listening, especially NATO members, we do this for you. It really is fun. And I think, Mike, we're in the eye of the storm because we're just getting started, and it's going to be week after week. This is our Super Bowl this whole season for the movies. And what a great place to be. Again, Mike Polydorus, my wonderful co-host, president of Paper Airplane Media. And I'm Paul DeGarabedian, senior media analyst for Comscore. And Mike, I'll see you at the movies, and I hope to grab lunch with you soon because it's been too long.
Yeah, we're going to definitely have lunch in the next week or so.
All right, sounds good. And thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you soon.